everyone. Welcome to Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that our institute is sitting on Parramatta South Campus, which is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. We would also like to acknowledge and pay our respect to the Darug people's elders, past, present, and emerging. Chinese Australian history is one of the major interests of this institute. Following the great success of the first series, we have launched our second seminar series of Chinese Australian history. Today, we are delighted and privileged to have invited Professor and Major General Darryl Choy, AM, to give us the second lecture entitled The 1912 Chinese Revolution at Atherton. Professor and Major General Darryl Choy has had an amazing career and achieved so much across seemingly unrelated areas. Wherever he went, it's like he glittered. Professor Choy commenced his military career as an Army cadet before enlisting as a private and rose to the rank of a Major General. He is a qualified military engineer with major commands including the 5th Field Engineer Regiment and the 7th Brigade. He subsequently held the 3 most senior reserve appointments in the Army and Australian Defence Force. Professor Choy is also a qualified professional town planner, a fellow of the Planning Institute of Australia and a fellow of the Environmental Institute of Australia and New Zealand. He's a professor emeritus of environmental and landscape planning and a former head of planning at Griffith University. Lastly, but not least, as the 5th generation Australian with a Chinese and English heritage, he has developed a strong interest in genealogy. His family history research for his and his wife's families has embraced research in China, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia. It is not surprising that we have a record attending today for this lecture. Every one of us is very much looking forward to it. So during the lecture, you as audience can post your questions, which we found people do post questions actually when they do not need to show their face. That's why we use the webinar. So you can post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the lecture, I will read out the questions from you for Professor Choy to respond. Now, please welcome Professor and Major General Darryl Choy, AM, to give us the lecture.
Thank you, Jan. I'll just share my screen. Well, thank you for that introduction. And hello, folks. Before I start, I've just got to get this up and running. Just takes a while to work out that it's got to move. So let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners where you all are and where I am, and their respective traditional owners. And I acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. And I thank the traditional owners for managing the land and seascapes, which are the subject for our considerations. So let me just start situating where we are. Map of Queensland on the top right. So we're up in Far North Queensland, where we commonly refer to as God's country. The larger map, I've just put there some places that I'll mention briefly during the course of my talk. The geography is important, I guess. So I'm talking about the Atherton Tablelands, which takes in the town of Atherton and Herberton. It's well above sea level, but it's tropical rainforest, but it's much, much cooler up in that neck of the woods than down on the coast where Cairns and Innisfail is. So let's talk about the incident itself. Happened in the afternoon of the 20th of February, 1912. And the reporting of the incident in the press, you see Sydney Press, Brisbane, Bundaberg, Cairns Post, and the two at the bottom are New Zealand press headlines. But look at the language, you know, Chinese battle, Republicans and Manchus encounter at Atherton, North Queensland Chinese revolution at Atherton, Chinese at Atherton, echo of the revolution, a pitched battle, you know, such dramatic sort of statements. Now, I don't normally put up a lot of words on my PowerPoints, but this is important. This is how the Cairns Post, the Cairns Post is the local regional newspaper that takes in Atherton at that time. Well, still does, I suppose, under the heading Local Chinese War, Revolution at Atherton. I think it's important to read this out so that we get a sense of what I'm talking about. Advice from Atherton yesterday of a rather sensational nature reached the Post to the effect that the revolution in China has spread to the Chinatown of the Tablelands. It appears that there are two rival camps of Chinese at Atherton, the Republicans and those who remain loyal to the now extinct Manchu dynasty. For some time past, relations have been strained between the rival factions, and the recent celebrations and crackers and flag flying and other things did not tend to soothe the savage breast of the Manchus. Eventually, as the report goes, on Tuesday afternoon, the rival sections in Chinatown met in an open pitched battle in which stones, bottles, and any other handy missile were used, and several casualties on both sides resulted, but no fatalities are reported. After the battle had waged for some time, the police arrived on the scene of carnage, and the outcome of their arrival was the arrest of 4 of the combatants. But whether they were Republicans or Manchu is not stated. After that, both armies rested in their respective camps, uttering dire and dreadful threats of what would happen when reinforcements and arms arrived. It was stated that the reinforcements for the Republicans left Cairns for Atherton yesterday, so also did reinforcements of police, and Inspector Malone left for the scene of the hostilities today. It is stated that prior to the departure of the Chinese contingent from Cairns, some purchase of revolvers and ammunition were made. So there's the report in the Cairns Post the day after the incident. The Cairns Post went on, and I just put this up here because it just shows you how they're dramatising this incident. Further advice are awaited from a special war correspondent dispatched by the Post to the field of battle in the Chinatown of Atherton. Well, was it really a battle? Let's have a look. Before we do so, fake news didn't start with Donald Trump. It started way back here, and goodness knows before that. But here it is, the Sun, the good old Sun in Sydney, on the 23rd of February, Chinese battle, Republicans and Manchu encounter at Atherton. It built on the original story, and it had added this garbage. The Republicans mostly have no pigtails and are labourers working on farms and banana and pineapple plantations. The Manchus are mainly merchants, fantail bosses and shopkeepers. The Manchu, referred to as Tong, remain loyal to the Qing dynasty. Most Chinese in Atherton have revolvers. Republican reinforcements shouted "Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité" as they boarded the train in Cairns, armed with revolvers. Well, I had trouble saying those words, so I don't think my ancestors could say those words. So the question that we got to pose is, where did the press get this notion of a continuation of the Chinese Revolution on Australian soils? Where did that come from? Did they just make it up? A couple of other questions that I've posed. What are the origins of this notion? The notion that it was a continuation of the Chinese Revolution. And where did this fantasy originate from? Just to put this in context, so the date of the Atherton incident is the 20th of February, 1912, and the official date of the revolution in China, which started on the 10th of October, although, you know, there's various dates, but this is the normal accepted period of the revolution, and concluded on the 12th of February, 1912. So the incident only happened a few days after. Things started to go a little bit quieter, if that's the right way to describe it, in China at the time. So the original police report, I went to that first of all in the State Archives. It's dated the 21st of February, so it's a day after. There's some images of the police in North Queensland, mounted police at that time. So Constable Creedy of the Atherton police, he was the constable in charge of Atherton, and that's the nearest police station. He gave a report to Inspector Malone, his boss, in the Cairns district. Cairns district encompassed Atherton. And Maloney in turn gave a report to the police commissioner who was in Brisbane. So we got these reports being generated and sent across the country. So there's Maloney and Cahill, the commissioner. So on the 21st of February, he whacks off his first report. Now, this is a telegram. So, and this is how it sort of sits in the archives. Creedy telephones. Free fight occurred Chinatown, Atherton yesterday afternoon between Republicans and monarchist Chinese. So there it is in the original police report. 10 slightly injured, 1 seriously injured, but no likely end fatality. 4 arrested, grievous bodily harm. 150 took part, but only 40 combated. Sticks, stones and bottles were weapons used. Row started in gambling school, not out in the open, gambling school. Outside Chinese now coming in and may renew trouble. Lately Chinese Freemasons, now that's interesting, Freemasons Lodge established there and has about 150 members who are Republicans. Suppose this has much to do with faster stop. I think the stop was supposed to be a full stop. Before receipt this message received, report this morning that 10 Chinese left for Atherton armed to participate row and instructed Creevy to take action and get assistance if required. All right, well, you'll see later that he got those figures wrong. So Creedy's official account the next day, and I've just summarised it here. So he told Inspector Malone the fight was premeditated. It was his position that it was the outcome of bitter feelings between the Masons and the non-Masons. Well, now, see, it's starting to move away from the notion about it being Republicans and monarchists and Masons and non-Masons. I don't know whether they were even in existence down in Victoria at that stage. The Masons alleged that the non-Masons wanted to break up the society in Atherton. The non-Masons were the most bitter. Fong On and Chong Yi believed to be the ringleaders. 9 of the 11 injured, included Su Duck, were Masons. Su Duck was the most unlucky guy there, and you'll see why later. All 4 arrested were non-Masons. All right, so Creedy is starting to pigeonhole various people now in terms of whether they're Masons or non-Masons. Evidence points to non-Masons being the premeditators. All right, so that's Fong On and crew. Some leading Chinese storekeepers are non-Masons, while others are Masons. Well, no firearms or weapons observed with Chinese. No truth in the rumour that Chinese were buying firearms. And he's expecting a large gathering of Chinese to assemble in Chinatown on the following Sunday, that's the 25th, and subsequent Sundays until the case is settled and matters settled. So that's sort of the guts of what Creedy's telling Malone. So as I was saying, the police are now starting to put their emphasis away from that notion about Republican monarchist combatants towards members or opponents of a Chinese Masonic society. But it was too late. The press were going to run with the other story. So I've laid out here a little calendar, Tuesday, where the initial disturbance took place and what happened. And as you can see there, Su Duck was the only seriously injured and hospitalised. He lost about 4 teeth. And then there were 4 so-called non-Masons, Chi, Young, Fong On and Chong Yi, arrested, and they were all remanded in custody. So they spent a couple of nights in the Atherton jail. And then you start to see the original Cairns Post article on Thursday. That's 2 days after the event, and it's after the police report, And if you have a close look at the Cairns Post article, it resembles even words, you know, and phrases out of the police report. So my theory is that the Cairns reporters or the Cairns Post had access to the police reports. Whether it was given to them freely, who knows at this stage. Or did Inspector Malone have what they have today, a press conference for the press? But anyway, it's clear the Cairns Post relied on the original police report for the notion about this being a continuation of the revolution in China on Australian soils. And of course, by then, the Post had syndicated it. So you see Friday the 23rd, it's gone around the world, not just, throughout Brisbane and regional Queensland. It's gone interstate, went to Western Australia, Adelaide, and overseas, particularly to New Zealand. Okay, so there's reports coming in all the time. And then the next 5 days, the things start to quieten down. So, the farmers were coming into Chinatown, camping there, having meetings, but no more violence occurred. And Malone returned to Cairns. But then, of course, the networks and Bush Telegraph worked fairly well, and I'll talk about this later. 55 Chinese arrived in Atherton by train, and they came from Cairns, Redlynch and Innisfail, and they certainly had revolvers. And you got about 250 farmers from the Atherton tablelands come into Chinatown. And by this stage, the police had been reinforced. So what's the context for this incident? I mean, why were there so many, Chinese in the Atherton district at this time? What were they engaged in that led to this incident? And what role, if any, did the events in China at this time play in causing the incident? So let's have a look at the Chinese occupation of Atherton at this stage. So the genesis of the occupation, the pull factors, in the 1880s, there was a decline of the Palmer River goldfields, just running out of gold. And likewise for, other goldfields in the north. Early 1880s, cedar timber was in demand. So the cutters found stands of grown cedar timber at Piebald Creek, which is in the vicinity of where Atherton is now. And in 1880, they found tin at Herberton. So a lot of the gold miners thought, well, maybe we should go tin mining. Herberton is not far from Palmer and Cooktown. But then there was going, towards the 1890s and so on, there was a decline in timber, and the European miners at Herberton really pushed back against the Chinese miners coming in, so much so that they lobbied the state, the colonial government to enact legislation which is excluded Chinese or other aliens, as the legislation refers, from tin mining for a number of years after it's after the field is registered. They could still go gold mining, but not tin mining. So tin mining was out for the Chinese at Herberton. So the consequences of all this, there was increasing number of Chinese turning to agriculture and market gardening. And the principal focus for agriculture in the Atherton district became maize. And the Chinese started to concentrate at Piebald Creek, and that's adjacent to what we now know as Atherton, then known as Prior's Pocket. And in the late 1890s, early 20th century, there's an increasing number of Chinese attracted to the Atherton maize industry. So the factors of attracting Chinese to the maize industry, well, maize cultivation lent itself to Chinese hand hoe methods. That's important. You didn't have to clear all the land to get the horse and plough in. Maize growing did not deplete the soil in the same way that banana growing does. Any new cleared area could be used to expand production of maize and not used to replace worked out areas, say from banana growing. It offered a cash crop that was quick in return after planting. The emerging Atherton tableland dairy industry provided increase in guaranteed market, and the corn could be stored in anticipation of market price rises. So you didn't have to sell it off straight away if the prices weren't right. The Cairns Atherton railway line was completed in 1903. So that offered ready access to the port and to the coastal areas. And unlike bananas, maize was not plagued by transport difficulties and cyclones. Okay, so there's some of the reasons why it was quite attractive to the Chinese to get into the maize industry. And it's also, there was a 1913 Royal Commission on the fruit industry, and one of the witnesses to that, Tam Sai, gave an account that he believed over 1,000 Chinese abandoned banana growing. That would have been around Ennisvale and those low coastal areas, and they moved to the Atherton tablelands for maize cultivation. So early growth in the Atherton maize industry, I call this an arrangement of mutual convenience, and this is an important point. And I'm quoting from Gilmore here in his PhD. The needs of the Chinese to make a living coincided with the needs of the white settlers to fulfill their obligation of residency on their selections. And thus it was the Chinese who were the principal mainstay of early agriculture. So the big issue at the time, and in many decades to come, would be, could the white man inhabit and work in the tropics, in the humid, hot tropics? And, you know, that's the reason why, on that belief that they couldn't or they wouldn't, they needed cheap labour. Hence the Kanakas, the South Pacific Islanders, Chinese, the Japanese, the Malays, the Indians, so on, were brought in. But Atherton was certainly in the tropics, but because it was elevated, it had cooler weather. So it was, for all intents and purposes, the vision splendid for the Europeans. The only problem was, it was thick vine forest, thick rainforest. So how do you plant in there? How do you put a cow in there? So the Europeans, the settlers needed to clear their property within 5 years to gain freehold title. That was the colonial government system for a selector. They needed to demonstrate occupancy of the selection, and they needed an income in that time while they're, you know, clearing it to put their first crop in. Solution, well, the other side of the coin, the Chinese couldn't own land unless they were naturalized. They couldn't work, they could work in the tropics, clearing dense forest, and they could grow maize on newly cleared land, the hand-hoe technique. So here's the arrangement of mutual convenience. Europeans hired the Chinese to clear the vegetation and or subleased their property to the Chinese for the duration of the freeholding period. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Well, let's see what that arrangement led to. It's a bit hard to get stats on this, but this is the growth in area under maize in the Atherton district from a range of different sources, as you can see there. But you can see the big jumps between 1908 and 1912. And hence the Chinese population is growing exponentially according to that. And then the peaks coming in 1917, which is an important year in our discussion. Because you see that asterisk there, 1919, 16,000 acres of Atherton land was resumed for soldier settlers. In terms of rent being paid by the Chinese to the European settlers, varies, but different sources, but basically it was about £1 per acre per year is what they were paying in rent. So that means they had to make more than £1 per acre per year in order to live and then to get a profit. But it didn't exceed that by much. And the 1906 year is a bit suspect anyway. So let me just deal with this idea about the arrangement of convenience. Here's the emergence of a very narrow-minded view. And I'll read this out because it's important. The future of Atherton by this so-called expert called the Wanderer. Having visited and traversed the Atherton district several times, and after exhausting inquiries into its capabilities, there is no doubt that it is an ideal, daring district. But there are many obstacles in the way of success just at present, the most serious being the presence of so many Chinese occupying by lease the splendid agricultural lands most contiguous to the town. So that was in the Cairns Post. It was a much longer article. He went on to say, or to claim, the lease arrangements were favourable to the Chinese. He says the rents were between 5 shillings and £1. Well, they were nowhere near 5 shillings. I think my previous information showed that. The return from maize, he's saying, was somewhere between £12 and £20 per acre. Well, I'm going to show you where that's a big fib as well. 9/10 of the revenue was sent to China. Well, I don't know how he got that information. And here is the value of the maize crop. Pounds per tonne. Now, can you see 20 there anywhere? So clearly there was a lot of misinformation, a lot of false news, a lot of rumour, a lot of innuendo, and a lot of heated debate being generated. Just imagine if they had the technology today with the internet and Facebook, what sort of garbage would be going around the airwaves. So anyway, you can see there are some big years, presumably getting towards that end of the period that I'm looking at, 1919, and so on. So the question is, what proportion of the Atherton maize industry was grown by Chinese? I've had to use some unsubstantiated press reports here. There's an image of a typical Chinese maize farmer. Thanks to Gordon Grimwade for that photograph. I didn't acknowledge that, Gordon. Sorry, mate. 1901, Gilmore in his PhD work says about 80% was Chinese grown. Morning Post in 03 says about 80%. It's pretty consistent. Townsville Daily Bulletin, 1912, the year of our incident, practically all of the 30,000 tonnes grown was grown by Chinese. And the Catholic Press in 1916, about 90% of the recorded crop. So, it's obviously the majority is being grown by the Chinese. So let's look at the growing community. Again, from various sources, looking at the numbers, back when there was only just timber getting, you got about 100, just over 100 there. You can see the important year there is 1904, well, somewhere between 01 and 04. The research done in America says that have a viable Chinatown, you need about 350 people. And that's when Atherton Chinatown reached that threshold, hence they got a temple at that stage. But look, whether or not there was 2,000 there in 1918, I can't substantiate, that's just one record, but certainly from all I've read, the numbers were really increasing by that time. It might have been a little bit less than that, somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000 perhaps. But you can see where the big surges were. And it correlates with the land being cleared and a portion of Chinese in the maize industry. So establishing Chinatown. I just want to read what Birdles has written here, because I think this is important as well to clear this up. Birdles says, and I quote, "It is unlikely that the separation was a conscious exclusion of the Celestials and the Mongolians by Atherton residents. Rather, the operating factor was colonial legislation which prohibited Chinese from owning land either as town lots or as agricultural selection." So yeah, I can't find any evidence that, like you find in New Zealand, for example, where it was legislated Chinese couldn't live in the white man settlement and yet to live 1 mile outside the post office, a radius from outside the post office. Or in Victoria, there was some of that exclusion as well in legislation that prevented Chinese from living inside the towns of the day. So that wasn't the case here. Both those guys there, Lee Tsai, Kwong Wah Lee, are Republicans, staunch Masons. Atherton, Chinatown, I really haven't got much time to go through all of this, but from all the literature on the left-hand side, I've listed the key elements of a Chinatown. And it's as you'd expect, a proper, balanced town. Places to live, places to shop, places to eat, places where you access medical services, recreation, clubhouses, community halls and temples. And, on the right-hand side, Atherton had them all, except I should add, there is no evidence of Atherton Chinatown having brothels, which is unlike other Chinatowns you find, well, around Australia or around the world. Certainly Cairns had them, but I can't find any reference. In fact, some people have some of the researchers have gone to great lengths to say there were no brothels in Atherton Chinatown. So that's an interesting issue. All right, so I think you get the picture. It wasn't just a number of people living together. It had the full kit and caboodle of a proper town, self-sufficient. There's some imagery of it. The image to the top right is about circa 1912, Main Street. The temple about the same time, and there's a map from Lilly, which is a take from other maps that were done earlier about the one gazetted road, bit of a right angle bend, but that one road has most of the establishments that I talked about before. What I want you to take note of is the farmhouse at the top of the map. Can you see that? Loder's Farmhouse. I'll come back to that later. Loder's Farmhouse. I mean, that's well and truly in urban Atherton now. So here's a bit of a close-up map, a redrawn map, thanks to Gordon Grimwade. And his daughter did a artist impression of Fong On's residence, and I've located, the arrow locates that, and I'm locating the temple. Of course, as you probably all be aware, the temple is the only last remaining structural element of Chinatown there now, and it's owned by the National Trust. So, just going into the economic, social and cultural organisation of a Chinatown, I'm using Chrisman's segmentary model here. It's based on Thompson's work in 1980, but it makes sense to me. The people that study this is not my field, but they say that this model fits the Chinatowns of the late 1800s, early 1900s, the turn of that century, particularly in places like Australia and America and Canada and so on. So I've used this model to analyse Atherton Chinatown. And as you can see at the base there, it's made up of surname, clan and village associations. And on top of that, the next hierarchy, if you will, is county and district associations. And then overarching in terms of governance and sponsorship and social welfare is a peak community organisation. In some places, it could be a secret society, or it could be a tong of merchants, or some other benevolent society or whatever. Okay, again, this is too busy. I just put it up to show you that Crispin's attributes for a Chinatown in terms of socio-economic attributes are listed on the left. And I've gone through and I've identified if those attributes of Crispin's apply situationally to Atherton, and just trust me, they do. They do. Atherton in Chinatown has every element of that theoretical model of Crispin's. Again, we're dealing with a stock standard Chinatown from the textbooks. Now, as I said back here, at the base, most Chinatowns, according to Rose Hum Lee, who's the American expert on Chinatowns, she's the one that worked out the threshold for a Chinatown. And she's also said that if not at the beginning, but over time, the sort of power structure in a Chinatown goes to the dominant surname group or clan. So in Atherton Chinatown, unfortunately, there's no business directories that I could find, no postal directories, and no census that we'd normally use to work out, these sort of stats. So what I've done is I've got Eli Finch to go through a Chinese language newspaper, and we found some donor lists, because these guys were big into raising money for the fatherland or for relief funds or whatever. So we found a big one. It's got hundreds and hundreds of names, and poor old Eli has gone through that, and we worked out the most frequently occurring surname. And guess what? It's Lee. And then a version of Wong is 38 frequency. But look at the gap. Look at the gap. It's Lee by a long shot. So they were certainly the dominant named group in Atherton, Chinatown. So let me just add another dimension to this discussion. So there are a lot of critics, and any of you who've read a lot of the so-called English language garbage around unknown experts on Chinatown, this what I'm about to read now will be you'll relate to it. It comes from a web page that Kevin Rains put together, and he's citing a description of Chinatown from the Queensland Supplement of May 1882. So these are my words for a start. Many Europeans would have only seen Chinese settlements through their culturally ignorant and jaundiced Western world views, tempered by repeated racial discriminatory utterances of the press and politicians, which demonise Chinatown as, and Kevin says, vice-ridden ghettos consisting of small, dilapidated and tiny tenements huddled together without any attempt at uniformity and without any regard to sanitary regulations. Well, what a load of cobwash. So if you go to the literature, to the record, and using some early work of Gordon Grimway, he cites evidence that, in Gordon's words, it was apparent that this is the Chinese of Chinatown, called in a geomancer to ensure that the buildings were sited according to the principles of feng shui. Well, isn't that a surprise? It wasn't just hilly-billy. It wasn't just with no attempt at uniformity. And Price says in an article, in a book that she put together, she records the minutes. The Tinaroo Shire Council introduced a new sanitary service for Atherton on the 1st of January 1908, and they extended that service to include 32 pans for Chinatown, whereupon all cesspits were ordered to be filled in. So Atherton Chinatown was given a sanitary system at the same time the Europeans got it in Atherton. So where are these guys coming from saying without any regard to sanitary regulations? So from Gilmore, the town has been described as neat and orderly with one street, solid buildings, permanent water from wells and gardens which allowed self-sufficiency, supporting a herbalist, doctor, 2 gambling houses, a restaurant, blah, 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 all right? And that was Gilmore's description. So I put it to you that on the written record, there's enough evidence to counter all these jaundiced views and writings that have been around about Chinese Chinatowns. So let's talk about this anti-Chinese sentiment. And it was known colloquially in the press as oust the Chow campaign. So European discontent, this is what they were claiming. The Chinese had less overheads and could survive on lower profits. Chinese had the advantage of a lower standard of living and a different work ethic. Chinese profits from the maize industry went back to China, nothing spent in the district. I mean, this is unbelievable stuff. The initial storage of the grain by the Chinese in bags, as opposed to tanks, promoted claims of spreading weevil infestation. Chinese used cheaper labour, other Chinese or Aboriginals, and were more successful in attracting Aboriginal labour than the Europeans. I'll pick that point up later. Chinese maize industry blocked European moves into dairying. I mean, that was part of the problem. They wanted more land in the dairy. And the presence of the Chinese discouraged southern selectors from investing in the district. So at this point, enter Edward Crevler, Ted Putt. This guy is a piece of work. Now, Kathy May, she claims, and I believe her, Putt was, in her words, consistently antagonistic to the Chinese and was responsible for practically every anti-Chinese move initiated at Atherton between 1888 and 1900. I mean, the guy only came out from England in the 70s and only got to Atherton in the early 1880s. And this guy used his position on the Tinaroo Divisional Board, which is the equivalent of a Shire Council today. He used his position there and he used his influence in an organisation called the Barron Valley Farmers Association, the BVFA. I'll talk about that later. There's a photograph of good old Ted, flanked by his 2 sons. So between the 3 of them, they had 3 big properties at Carrington, just outside Atherton. And guess what? Who cleared their land? Chinese. He engaged Chinese labourers to clear his land. So, typical Putt actions. In 1890, I've got a reference to him successfully moving in a divisional board meeting that Chinese hawkers be taxed £3 because he said the hawkers were taking away work from the Europeans. Through that same divisional board 2 years later, he called on the colonial government to introduce exclusion legislation for the Chinese, similar to that already in place for the Pacific Islanders in Queensland. That same year, he included anti-Chinese statements in his business advertisements in the local newspapers. And I've got one of those later in the presentation. I mean, this guy really had it in for the Chinese. And in a letter to the editor, which was anonymous, but it was signed Herbert, signed a farmer of Carrington, he complained that Chinese had virtual monopoly on the carrying business. And, you know, without any other evidence, I'm pretty certain that was him. And in 92, he called for the establishment of an anti-Chinese league in Atherton. So there's his public notice that he paid for to call for the anti-Chinese league. So before he did that, back in the 1880, there was a failed attempt by the Herberton Advertiser to boycott Chinese hawkers and favour European co-op. That failed. Then Putt's 1892 anti-Chinese league was established. In 98, the BVFA campaigned on alleged Chinese attraction of Aboriginal labour with opium. They were claiming that the reason why the Chinese were better at getting Aboriginal labour than the Europeans was because they were paying them with opium. That kick-started a report by the colonial government, and Roth, Inspector Roth, the protector of Aboriginals based in Cooktown, was sent to investigate. And guess what? He found no evidence of Chinese paying Aboriginals for their labour in opium. Now, in Roth's report, guess what he quoted? He quoted a statement from Putt, and it went, "Putt, I have shot 13 or 14 niggers in this district, and this is all the government has done for me. I can't get a B nigger when I want one. They all go to the Chinese." Well, I don't think the Aboriginals were smart enough to know that they didn't want to get shot. Don't work for Putt. Anyway, interesting statement that Putt made, and Roth actually used it in his report to the government. In 1908, there was a White Atherton League formed, and that included the Great Atherton Hoax, which I haven't got time to go into today, but that's another paper. But whether this White Atherton League had anything to do with the White Australia League, I haven't found any solid evidence at this stage, so I can't make that connection. And then the pro-dairy lobby started their anti-Chinese campaigns, and the strapline they were using was "the cow will oust the chow," and that was plastered everywhere. So there's Putt's ad I was telling you about before. "One man, one vote, Chinese no vote at all. Putt and Sons Produce and Merchants, Watsonville." So I want to now just give you some examples of what I consider as early apartheid thinking. Now, don't forget, apartheid was invented by the Afrikaans in South Africa well into the last century, well before this. Here's example number one. The White Atherton League in 1908 sought railway authorities to provide separate compartments for Asians in carriages on the Cairns-Atherton line. Now, I haven't found any evidence whether they went through with that, but that's what they were lobbying for, the White Atherton League. My second example is immediately after the February 1912 fiasco, the Atherton Hospital Committee called tenders for the construction of an aliens ward, because they had to admit all the injured Chinese into their wards and keep them there for overnight or a number of days, depending on the seriousness of the injury. So straight after that, they said, well, we're going to build an aliens ward. And again, I haven't been able to find out whether they did that or not. All right, place of contradictions. This is really interesting. Atherton is such a place of contradiction. My first example is this one here, which is the sort of one I mentioned before. The majority of anti-Chinese organisations were made up of European farmers who used the Chinese to clear their selections or sublease to them, but they were also members of these anti-Chinese organisations, namely the White Atherton League or the BVFA. So on the one hand, they're joining the anti-Chinese organisation. On the other hand, they're quite happy to use the Chinese to suit their own economic purposes. So there's the first contradiction. The second contradiction is a beauty. The owner of the land in which Chinatown is located, Giles or Geo Loader, remember I said, look at that farmhouse up the top of that map of Chinatown. Well, that was Loader's farmhouse. He owned all the land on Chinatown, and he rented it out. So every property on Chinatown was paying rent to Loader. And yet Loader was a prominent member of the Queensland Labor Party. And he upheld the White Australia policy and the Queensland Aliens Restriction Act. And Loader was quoted in the newspapers on the political platform promoting anti-Chinese propaganda. and yet he was drawing all this money from the Chinese. So there's my second contradiction. And the third one is the Tinaroo Shire Council, the old divisional board, in 1905 resolved to fix the rates for Chinatown tenements, and they then made the occupier responsible for the rates, not the owner. The owner, Geo Loader, was then free. He was taken off the rate book. So I don't know how that works, but of course, Loader was a former councillor on that council. So it's a place of contradictions, folks, place of contradictions. So let me, again, I haven't got time to do this, but I just want to demonstrate something with this diagram, how international and national events may have influenced what was happening in Atherton. So I've tried to map these out in a chronological sort of diagram and align them. And if you do a quick look at that, you'll see that some of these line up. I mean, that's telling you the bleeding obvious. But the point you take from this is communication was pretty rapid, because the Chinese in Atherton were only finding out what was going on, not only in China, but in southern states where the bulk of the Chinese were, you know, the Sydneys and Melbournes, a day or 2 days after the event. So that's a fruitful area for further research, folks, about how were they communicating? What were they using? I mean, they didn't have the internet. So just the lead up to the incident, in 1908, there was this Chinese organization called the Reformers League in Atherton. Not too much known about that, but it certainly existed. 1909, we know from something in Kathy May's book, a minor outbreak of violence, several windows broken. She kind of suggests that was a Republican monarchist sort of stoush in 09. But again, no other evidence. And I can't comment any further on that. In June 1911, the Yi Hing Society was formed in Atherton. That date's important. It's only, 8 months to the 1912 incident. 2 months after, Fong On, and I'll use the title et al., Fong On and others, established what he called a hatchet league to counter the Yi Hing, the hatchet league. And then, you know, once the sort of revolution in China was coming to a successful end, a bit of mopping up to do and looked like things were happening right. Things were very fluid, of course. The Atherton Chinese had a flag raising ceremony, 17th of December, 1911. And then on Boxing Day, flag raising ceremony in Cairns. When you compare the attendance, a lot of the same people in Atherton and Cairns in those. Then early 1912s, so I haven't got the exact dates, they had flag raising ceremonies in Tolga, where there was another large concentration of Chinese, and ditto for Geraldton. Geraldton is now Ennisfale. So there's some lead ups to the event that we're talking about. I just put this up here because in the flag raising ceremonies in Far North Queensland, they used the wrong flag. That's the flag they used, but it wasn't the official 5-coloured flag, which is what the national government adopted in 1911, 1912. They didn't, this is the Taiwanese flag now, and Sun Yat-sen didn't, I mean, even though he designed this before the revolution, it wasn't brought into official use in, I think, the late 1920s or somewhere around about that. Anyway, let's do a reinterpretation of the 1912 incident. The warring sides. Well, you got the Yi Hing Society, which was formed in June the previous year. They also used other terms, and these might have been sub-elements, but there was the Chinghun Tong, that was, we know they were in Atherton, they were in Geraldton, and they were Cairns. Yi Hing 3-Dot League, Cairns and Atherton. And then we had this Hatchet League of Fong Ons, and not long after he changed the name to the Communal Benefit Association, and not long after that, more respectable English sounding title, Association of Agriculture, Labour and Commerce. Now, the Yi Hing Society started getting donations on behalf of the Bureau of Military Fundraising, because Sun Yat-sen had put the word out worldwide to all the diasporas, raise money because I need to raise a military, hence the Bureau of Military Fundraising. And the Yihing Society in Australia took that on. And they did quite successful. They were quite successful. The Hatchet League, they started collecting money for this thing called Hang Chan subscription, which is a bit strange, but anyway, that's what they were collecting money for. So why this Hatchet League? You know, where does that name come from? It had me puzzled. So as I say at the bottom there, in American Chinese community, the hatchetmen were the salaried soldiers of the Tongs. And they are also known in America as the highbinders because they bound their queues on the top of their head to prevent them from being grabbed by an opponent. What was their weapon of choice? It was a cut down hatchet. And there's one there. So that's what they went into battle with, the hatchet. And I just put these up here because, you know, there's been a movie made of it and there's a lot of books written about it. Now, I suspect that Fong On and Company used that title as an intimidatory term. Whether or not they used any hatchets up there, as you see from the description, to his bottles, stones and sticks. I'm not aware they used actual hatchets, but I think calling themselves the Hatchet League, it was an intimidating term that would hopefully put fear into their opponents. Anyway, that's my theory. The Main Protagonist, the Yihing Society. Well, the literature, including Kathy May, said it was Li Sai. He adopted an English first name later, so he's known in a lot of the English world as Edward Li Lai, but he had, you know, obviously a number of other names, and there's one there that came from some of his family notes. I've had access to the Li Sai, I should say, family information. The Hatchet League, well, there he is there in later years. Fong On, he adopted the name George to give him more of an anglicised name. That's him much later in life. Certainly he'd be much younger in 1912. But my research says that the real Yihing leader was this guy here, Li Choy. And he used the name Sunshan Li, which we've now discovered is the name of his firm. So like so many Chinese merchants, they adopted their business name as their real name in European society. So Li Choy is my pick for the real leader. And why do I say that? Well, I think he was a leader of that 1908 Reformist Association that I mentioned previously. He certainly was the first named signature on some correspondence we've got. He was the reader and the orator for the main Cairns flag raising ceremony. I mean, you don't give that to someone who's not someone in the society. You know, someone who's of no standing is not going to get that job. So he was given that job. He was the promoter or a promoter of the military fund donation. And he promoted that and he negotiated that. So I think he was the actual leader. He was the main speaker at the Tolga, sorry, spelling mistake there, Tolga flag raising ceremony. He was the speaker at the Geraldton flag raising ceremony. So this guy's getting around. And he personally was in communication with the Melbourne Young China League in 1912 and its precursor, which was known as the New People's Awakening Association in 1908, you know, linking back to the Reformers Association. So we know that the Young China League was overtly Republican, the one in Melbourne at least. And we know that in 1911, November 1911, just before the outbreak of violence in Atherton, the Young China League in Victoria formed an alliance, an allegiance with the Yihing Society of Victoria. So it's all starting to make sense. And his name appears as the first signature on many letters, and one in particular for the Chikung Tong that was reproduced in the Chinese Times in 1912. So that's interesting that he was using that title of an organisation when my research says, unless I'm using the wrong references, that the Chinese Masonic Society in Sydney didn't adopt Chi Kung Tong title until 1919. At least that's what Yong says. So anyway, that's who I would pick as the real leader of the Atherton Chinese, and probably for the Yi Hing throughout Far North Queensland as well. And we know from Kathy May that he was the Grand Master for Chinese Masons in Atherton in 1915. So he certainly got there in the end if he wasn't there before. And guess what? He's the older brother of Lee Sai, the guy that everyone thinks was the leader. Now, a number of theories here. I can't imagine a younger brother being made a boss over his older brother. Now, not unless you're dealing with that movie called The Godfather. I don't think it would happen in Chinese society. Could be wrong. And it was Lee Choy that brought Lee Sai out to Australia. He sponsored him and he paid for him to come. And then he obviously nurtured him and coached him. That's not to say that Lee Sai didn't become the leader later after Lee Choy started to step down. But at the Atherton incident, my money's on Lee Choy. He was born in 1862, came to Australia in the early 1890s. He's recorded as a corn farmer in Cairns. Well, obviously that's wrong, it's Atherton. He retired in 1935, returned to China to his first wife. He had 2 marriages in Australia with bucket loads of kids, and most of them, well, some of them went back to China for education, but a lot of them are still here. He and his first wife became Buddhist monks, and they went to live in Lantau, Ireland, and they're both buried there. So that's as much as I know about Lee Choy at this stage. Okay, let's talk about the Li Hing version of the 1912 incident. This was published in the Chinese Times in March of that same year. They claimed that the opponents spread rumours that their society, the Li Hing Society, was about to impose 5 shillings a tonne on maize produced in the Atherton area, a bounty. They said they were spreading rumours, and those rumours were used to recruit members. They claimed the rumours were used to recruit members for the alternate new league to oppose the Yi Hing, that's the Hatchet League. They claimed they didn't start the 20th of February incident. It was started by the Hatchet Society. And the trouble started over a trivial matter, which led to the assault on the Yi Hing members. Well, we know from the police reports, it happened in a gambling den. So they would have seen that as it was a game of dominoes, apparently, and someone was accused of cheating. But you know, he's probably set up to start it. It was the Yi Hings who called the police. Immediately, the fight broke out. And the Yi Hings said that the Hatchet Society was superiors in numbers, financial resource and influence, and they refuted all claims made by Fong On. Now, the truth starts to come out in some of this correspondence. Apparently, Fong On and a few others attempted to join the Yi Hings back in 1911, but was rejected. The reason why it was rejected is because the Darwin Yi Hing warned the Atherton Yi Hing against Fong On, because he lived all his early life in Darwin once he got from China, and then he came to Atherton. He lost all his money in Darwin, so he came to Atherton to start again. He was a real big gambler and lost his shirt 3 different times in his life. So he was critical of the Yi Hings, and he ran foul of them up in Darwin. So obviously they said, well, don't sign this guy up. You don't want him in your midst. So he took, Fong On took objection to that. And the Yi Hings accused Fong On of running a gambling den, and that's true. One of the gambling dens in Atherton, Chinatown, was Fong On's, and they accused him of selling sly grog. And And they said, well, what, you know, we're the official money collectors for Sun Yat-sen and the nationalist cause. Why are you going around with this Hunshan? I mean, they only represent a small geographic area, and not all potential Chinese donors in Australia are from that area. So it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't. And they claimed the Hatchet League comprised henchmen that were using standover tactics against the business people and market gardeners. And they picketed different establishments and prevented people from selling their goods. And they claimed they were subjected to intimidation, mockery, and taunts. And here's two they gave as examples. Fong On's mysterious tooth extraction, but this is the best one. They had these signs up: persons wishing to have teeth extracted, please see Fong On. So however that translates into Chinese was put around the town. Okay, the Fong On version, or Fong On and others version, of what happened. This is against the Yi Hing's claims now. They claim Yi Hing started it with an ambush. They say that Yi Hing's called the police preemptively. And they note that the four that were arrested were eventually bailed by merchants at £60 per person. And that's where you start to get some cross-reference to the Yi Hing's letter, where they say that the Hatchet League had financial power and substantial influence. And they claim that it was the Yi Hing who gave the Western press the false story of the incident being a dispute between supporters of the revolution and supporters of the Qin dynasty. Well, I think I've shown you that that's not the case. So it certainly wasn't them. The Hatchet Society claimed to represent Atherton agriculture, labouring and commercial spheres. They claim the Yi Hing is only interested in gambling and intimidation. They claim the Yi Hing uses coercion to force people to join their ranks. And they claim that the Yi Hing took over the Atherton flag raising ceremony. So there you go. That's what's in the published record of the Chinese Times, which of course, as I said, is a Melbourne pro-Republican newspaper. There's a postscript to this, because after all those letters from the Yi Hing Society and the Hatchet League were published, in the next edition, there was an editorial of the editors of the Chinese Times, and they were virtually saying that it was time for the Yi Hing Society to disband or evolve into a new type of Republican organisation. And guess what? They did. So in Melbourne, where the Chinese Times comes from, it happened in 1914, and the Yi Hing was reorganised into the Chinese Masonic Society. And that followed in other parts of the colonies as well. So politics went on. So here's a photograph of the 1917 Cairns Atherton Nationalist League. And the Kuomintang set up a branch in Atherton 18th of February 1917. So things were marching on. So the post-incident, what happened? Well, here are some images of Atherton around the time of the incident, the railway station, where reinforcements were coming in and the police were coming in, the main drag of Atherton on the top left, the ambulance which was used to evacuate the injured from Chinatown, the hospital, the Atherton hospital where they were put, and the courthouse where Fong On and others were first tried before they moved into Herberton. So after the event, 28th of February, steamer arrives in Cairns from Atherton with reinforcements, and they joined up with Cairns Chinese, and 50 left for Atherton by train. By the 1st of March, they reckon there was just over 200 reinforcements on both sides, now in camp under tents. And the same day, there was a trial of the 14 arrested in Atherton, and they were held over for 14 days for the Herberton District Court. 4th of March, they were committed for the Herberton District Court, and that occurred on the 14th of March, and they were discharged. No answer for. So the closing of the Atherton Chinese chapter, or the end of the era. So there is this scheme to rid the Atherton district of the Chinese. There are many, but this one is during World War One, and it was for the returned soldiers, land for returned soldiers. So we find this started way, way back before the end of the war. Now, with the support of the local, what is now RSLs, the Tinaroo Shire Council lobbied the Queensland State Government to resume Chinese leased land, only Chinese leased land, not others, for the soldier settlement scheme. In April 17, the council resolved to recommend to the Lands Department that certain blocks of land then under maize production in the Atherton Tolga area be resumed for settlement and returned to soldiers. That was Chinese land. So they started mapping it out now. Right? They're starting to identify it and map it and get land titles. And this is all occurring under the umbrella of national and state and regional initiatives that were basically seeking to reward service during the war, and that reward was to settle in the tropics, populate the tropics. And not only that, that on the left at the bottom where it says Queensland, they were advertising for return British servicemen to come to Australia, specifically Queensland, specifically the tropics, and take up a soldier settlement block. And they were going to sponsor them, give them money and so on. So it wasn't just Australian return servicemen, it was British Commonwealth or Europeans. So there's the Discharge Soldier Settlement Act of 1917. It involved the resumption of land from Chinese maize growers, including their improvements. They resumed the lot. So officially 14,000 acres, might have been a bit more than that in the end. Freehold land. It was valued at £154,000. It was occupied by aliens, so-called, and reserved for settlement of soldiers. So Dempster makes this statement. By the end of the 1930s, it was evident that the scheme had failed due to insufficient land allocated and inaccurate, overburdening land valuations and debts imposed on settlement. The area's isolation from steady markets and the delay bureaucracy were paramount. So, like so many other soldier settlement schemes throughout Australia, the Atherton Tolga one failed. So, the relics of the bygone era. Statham says, and I quote, "It's unfortunate that memories of Chinese contribution to the settlement of North Queensland are often clouded in racial tension. These people are rarely given credit for their role as pioneering agriculturists." So the bottom right is somewhere after 1912. And you can see the buildings are starting to get a bit of a lean-to, some dilapidation. There's rubbish in the streets and so on. So I'd say it's after the land was resumed for the soldier settlement scheme and the Chinese exited big time. The top right is a building. It obviously was a Chinese maize grower, and that was a building that he built with his improvements, and that was taken over by a European soldier settler. So preliminary conclusions, and this is still work in progress. The incident definitely was not a dispute between republicans and monarchists. The maize industry was at the heart of the dispute. Gambling played a role as a catalyst for the incident. The positions and personalities appear to influence and trigger the course of events, certainly Fong On. The Western press did not interview participants or spokespersons for the Chinese community. The Western press relied entirely on police reports and accounts of the incident. There was no evidence of the warring parties attempting to reach out to the Western press to make their case. They made their case to the Chinese Times in Melbourne, a Republican, and both organisations. So the preliminary conclusions out of all that, Atherton Chinatown was a well laid out, sophisticated and functioning settlement, contrary to other garbage that's in the literature. The Atherton Chinese community were well connected to the southern Chinese community, well connected. They were well connected in North Queensland, a great network. There was significant interaction between Cairns and Atherton Chinese communities. It was only 90 kilometres apart, and it would be only a few hours by steam train within commuting distance. And a lot of, Lee Sai and Lee Choy, they had shops both in Cairns and Atherton and Tolga. So it wasn't just Atherton. The Atherton Chinese community took great interest in Chinese politics and were overwhelmingly Republican. The fast communication evident in the timing of events, as I said before, in Australia, is close to corresponding with events in China. And there's some evidence that native place affiliations were breaking down, because I've got evidence of people from the same village on opposing sides, Yi Hing versus Hatchet League, same village. So that's interesting. By 1912, that affiliation is starting to break down. It broke down a lot earlier, as I understand it, in the southern states. And just to finish this up, well, from a research perspective, the associated research for this paper, I think, demonstrates that the interpretation of events related to early Chinese in Australia through Western eyes and reported in English language newspapers needs to be treated with a high degree of caution. I know that's telling the bleeding obvious to many of you listening today. These events highlight the complex web of associations, partner and allegiances, the quickly evolving process of these associations. It's very quick. Their highly diverse nature of their purposes, their causes, and the splintering effect of certain events, changing values and allegiances, and the dominating role of certain leaders. And the local Chinese communities were very complex groupings of diverse interests with strong interest to China and other overseas organisations. They were not homogeneous, as we're often made out to be. So the final word comes from Lily. The misunderstanding and the prejudice of the past that ended the life of Atherton Chinatown have given way to a new appreciation of the contribution made by the Chinese to the development of North Queensland. And I trust that this paper has gone part of that way. I'd like to acknowledge the assistance I've had to date from Gordon Gimride, Ali Fish, Dennis Lee Sai, and Michael Williams. So thanks for listening, and if there's any time, happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Choy. It's a fascinating talk. It's the way you structured is really interesting and quite clear. From the beginning, you provided this context, and then into the history, the actuality, and then the review of the causes of the incident, and then draw your conclusion. It's really, really interesting. We should have broken up this lecture into two, and clearly there's a lot in there. It's not like as it sounds just incident. It's really fascinating. But I'm afraid we don't have much time because it's 20 minutes past. And I'll see if we go for one question. If I think Darryl needs water, yeah? We will go for one question because it's really running very late. Do you think, the question from Jonathan, do you think there is a connection between the Tino Roshai Council's vociferous complaints about Aboriginal people in the late 19th century and their campaign against the Chinese in the early 20th century? Any connection?
Oh, absolutely, Jonathan. I mean, that's an intuitive response from me because I haven't studied it in great detail. But yes, I think it's all connected. And it'd be interesting to know, what hearsay or what fact, what fiction from an earlier era found its way over in subsequent incidences that you're talking about. But, you would have thought that Roth's early report you know, given his background and so on, I know, you know, he had a few foibles, I should say, but you'd think that that would have put an end to it, but it didn't.
Well, Laura, let's go to the quickly second question. It's quite straightforward, I believe. As considering the Victorian and New South Wales, the Chinese population decreasing, you know, as in 11,950 in 1881, and New South Wales, the Chinese population was at 10,205. Queensland increased to 11,000-ish. So question is, do you think the Chinese population in Queensland actually came from Victorian or New South Wales rather than directly from China?
I don't know whether I can answer that. Because you know, it's not a field that I've studied, but I'm certain there would have been some migration north. Certainly, you know, in the gold days, the gold fields ran out much earlier in southern states than they did in the Palmer and the Gilbert and so on. So I'm sure that, I mean, that's the other interesting thing, that there was a lot of movement of Chinese sojourners in Australia and those that settled. I think there was a high degree of mobility. I've never read anything that conclusively proves that, but when you look at some individuals that I'm aware of, that they were moving around quite a lot. And as I've demonstrated here, you know, once the gold and the economic source, the source of their finances ran out, they had to move. And a lot of them, as Kathy May says, didn't go back to China when the gold ran out, because they still have to make their fortune, you know, or they still saw opportunities. So, yeah, I mean, they were moving around North Queensland quite a lot.
I just acknowledge Juanita's question. She said there are many parallels between what happened to Chinese community in Bathurst and Atherton. And so, you know, Chinese role in land clearing, soldier settlement, etc. So Juanita, come on and do a presentation on the, you know, Chinese community in Bathurst. So we're looking forward to that.
You took the words out of my mouth.
Good. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, obviously it's a fascinating talk, and it's very interesting these days that there are over 200 years later, when we look at the back at the history of Chinese Australians, we can see there is so much for us to investigate and to realize or re-realize the significance and reflect upon. So it is also quite important for the general public to see that the multifaceted, you know, history of Chinese Australians, not just one way. I just want to mention lately, Jennifer Wang and Li Jie has created a little TV miniseries for ABC iView called Chopsticks or Fork. They went to all historical Chinese restaurants in regions and found their stories, and including Pagoda restaurant in Atherton. So they touched on the history there. It's really touching to listen to those people's stories. You know, we only hear restaurants or see restaurant or even go to restaurant. We never have actually ask their stories. You know, their stories goes back to 20 or 50 or, you know, years ago. So it's really interesting, and their interactions with the community. So that's really interesting. So I think, you know, Chinese Australian history obviously is becoming increasingly more interesting and engaging a lot of people. So I really want to say, you know, Professor Choy's talk has certainly enriched our knowledge of Chinese people in Atherton, not just that incident, you know, Chinatown and all around, and the Chinese population maize industry is fascinating. So I really want to ask everyone to join me to thank Professor Choy's wonderful talk. And thank you, audience, for your support. Our next lecture is scheduled on 29th July by Dr. Drew Cottle, and we will send out the information and registration. So thank you again, and Professor Choy, and thanks everyone. Good evening.
Cheers. Thank you.